All right, what's cracking? Back into Deleuze and Guattari here. That is, we're continuing on with Anti-Oedipus. I'll do each of these chapters. There are 4 of them, so you can expect 4 parts. Although the 3rd chapter is long, so that might be might have to break that up a little bit. But we'll see how it goes. So I'll just jump right into this here. Don't want to waste people's time. What they're trying to get at with this chapter, at least as a general preface, is a critique, mounting a really strong critique of Freud, specifically the Oedipus complex. So there are some distinctions to be made here. They don't necessarily take up beef with psychoanalysis as like a practice. What their real aim is this thing called Oedipus that, to put it as simply as I can, just simply is too simple an idea for them. It doesn't encapsulate the workings of what they introduced to us in the first chapter, the idea of desiring production or machines or syntheses and how these things work together. So for them, Oedipus kind of nullifies all that or homogenizes all that and just places everything under the spectral light of mommy and daddy, which for them is simply reductive. So they are not only critiquing Freud for like a number of reasons, and other people have mounted these similar critiques. Like we can hear the resonances of similar things in thinkers like Baudrillard and even Foucault to some extent. But what they do that's really special is that they supplant it with something else. So they are saying that on the one hand, Freud is limited for X, Y, and Z reasons, but we can say that we have a better way to understand the world precisely because we have, we propose that the world is actually like this, for them, kind of schizophrenic framework that they propose as an alternative to the Oedipus or the Oedipalization of the world. So on the periphery, some of the figures they take on specifically are thinkers like Melanie Klein and Jacques Lacan, two thinkers for them that are really that really take up this psychoanalytic framework in a way that for them is wrong, because they say that we have to look at the world in this other way. But we'll get into that a little bit more specifically. But I will say right off the bat, as for the Lacan stuff, I know not as much as I should, so I'm going to be vague going into that, where I'll just present what I think I know, because I know that Lacanians, this isn't like just Lacanians, like for any theorist or followers of any theorist, like it's important to get their ideas right. So I'm going to say off the bat that I'm going to be deliberately vague and just try to deliver the words or communicate the words that Deleuze and Guattari use against Lacan, because that's really my only connection to it. I know it might be bad practice, but I don't have time to read Lacan for now. It's too much of it that one would have to read to actually understand it. So they lay out their project almost as follows, at least in this chapter. They suggest that wouldn't the real difference, and I'll explain what that is in a second, but wouldn't the real difference be between Oedipus, structural as well as imaginary, and something else that all the Oedipuses crush and repress, desiring production, the machines of desire that no longer allow themselves to be reduced to the structure of any more than to persons, and that constitute the real in itself, beyond or beneath the symbolic as well as the imaginary. So what they're trying to clarify here is that their project is not simply in the service of challenging what might appear on the surface of the Oedipal imaginary. So when one thinks of Oedipus, we think of the relationship between mommy and daddy and a child, and specifically how that triad affects the child and has a place within society. So what they say alternatively is that our criticism of Oedipus therefore risks being judged totally superficial and petty, as if it applied solely to an imaginary Oedipus and aimed at the role of parental figures, without at all penetrating the structure and its order of symbolic positions and functions. So I think that this is one of how they get at it by, proposing their alternative view of the world, but it also shows that they are trying to mount a critique that is much more nuanced than what some other thinkers may have been proposing at the time or before then. So one way that they approach this more nuanced endeavor is by taking the unconscious as one example. So they suggest that the unconscious is not something that necessarily symbolizes. It's not something that belongs to the domain of representation so simply. In fact, the unconscious, like everything else for them, and this is what constitutes the real, I'm using air quotes, the real, because everything operates at the level of a machine, where all machines can, be broken down, or all things can be broken down into their machinic functions. So the leg machine meets the hip machine, which meets the torso machine, which, knee bone meets the whatever. The book machine meets the hand machine. The book machine meets the eye machine. The telephone machine meets and it goes on and on. So for them, the unconscious is no different. The unconscious may very well exist. So Freud isn't wrong in that respect. But what it resembles is not a symbolizing apparatus that is somehow removed from its interaction with other things, because that would constitute a machine, right? Because we can think of Deleuze and Guattari as thinkers of syntheses. They think about things in terms of their being recognized not as a thing in itself, right? But as it's having a relationship with another thing that it can form something of a synthesis with. So for them, they want to enter the unconscious into that exact same framework, or that exact same, I guess, categorization of a thing, right? So the only way we can understand the unconscious is not by proposing it to be some transcendental thing that doesn't actually have an attachment to anything else, but just symbolizes. It, in fact, has a number of other connections. Connect to the brain machine, to the child machine, to the childhood memory machine, and so on and so forth. So for Deleuze and Guattari, the psychoanalyst, or the Oedipalist, renders the unconscious a theater or a stage for them. Simply a zone that projects other things. That's all it does. It's not, something that connects to other things. It's just like a television screen. So in that way, they characterize the psychoanalyst as being the thinker or the agent of anti-production. That is, they oppose the very logic of machines, because machines produce. They produce perhaps not by virtue of themselves, but by virtue of their coming into contact with other things, other machines. But that is precisely what they do. They produce, whereas the psychoanalyst is trying to wrest the world from this reality principle. And I don't mean reality principle in the psychoanalytic sense, but the idea of the real, according to Deleuze and Guattari. Trying to take it from that to give it something of a transcendent figure, a kind of transcendent character. Try to make it more than it really is. So if we have a system that is psychoanalysis or Oedipalization that tries to render transcendent, or tries to make law that which is not so, doesn't give itself over to that so easily, then that must rely on some fundamental axioms, because there have to be principles or rules that legitimize these beliefs. So one that they they address is the idea of lack. So if we remember from the first chapter, they express the idea that it is wrong to associate the desire with lack. So desire does not, or they actually make a distinction. They say that kind of oppressive desire is a desire predicated on lack. So desire that where you want something that you don't have, and you feel bad because you don't have it, but that lack is actually, God, my words are not flowing so well today. that lack is actually driving you in some way or other. That is a kind of bad desire. Whereas what the desire they propose in response to that is the idea of desiring production, where we are desiring to always be in contact with other machines, and all machines are desiring to be in contact with other machines. So lack doesn't even enter the equation for them. So this extends into the domain of psychoanalysis, where the whole discourse around lack, especially as it relates to gender differences or the differences between the sexes, is incredibly problematic for them. It's problematic, and for them it's also philosophically and structurally kind of unsound. So what they suggest of Freud is that the difference between the sexes that Freud draws is tied together by a common thread. And that common thread for them that they identify is the penis. So the penis is something the boy has, ostensibly, and it is something that the girl desires. So therefore, this kind of idea of the penis attaches the two of them together. And it is by virtue of them being attached together that Freud is able to make some pretty outlandish type claims. So as they write, this is on 59, something common to the two sexes is required, but something that will be lacking in both, and that will distribute the lack in two non-symmetrical series, establishing the exclusive use of the disjunctions, you are a girl or boy. Such is the case with Oedipus and its resolution, different in boys and in girls. Such is the case with castration and its relationship to Oedipus in both instances. Castration is at once the common lot, that is, the prevalent and transcendent phallus, and the exclusive distribution that presents itself in girls as desire for the penis, and in boys as fear of losing it, or refusal of a passive attitude. So what Freud does here, and they pick up on this, is quite clever. Freud imbues or kind of gives the sexes a certain value, and a certain value that is predicated on this common denominator, this what they call a transcendent phallus. And it is because of that they are able to then psychoanalyze the children, because they both created the problem to which only they have the solution. So this idea doesn't exist in nature, this idea of lack as in terms of one's genitalia. And so what Deleuze and Guattari do is oppose that idea, where they say the following: neither is there anything in common between the two sexes, nor do they cease communicating with each other in a transverse mode where each subject possesses both of them, but with the two of them partitioned off, and where each subject communicates with one sex or the other in another subject. Such is the law of partial objects. Nothing is lacking, nothing can be defined as a lack, nor are the disjunctions in the unconscious ever exclusive, but rather the object of a properly inclusive use that we must analyze. So again, here we're hearing the idea of the formulation of machines resonating here. That is, all machines, although they are different, do come in contact with one another, and the synthesis that contact forms is in itself a kind of new paradigm that is comprised of two or more parts that are in themselves different, but dependent on one another to form that whole, that kind of partial whole, which then constitutes them. So it's kind of like a circular effect here. So, okay, maybe I should give an example. Let's say, for instance, there was a ball. Now, this ball was pretty nondescript. It could serve as a soccer ball or a basketball or dodgeball or whatever. So let's say a child were to pick up this ball, and at that moment, the ball were to would exist as a soccer ball. So then in that moment, what we have emerge is a soccer player and a soccer ball kind of grouped together around the idea of the game soccer, or football for European people. So in that moment, there's this kind of synthesis between the soccer ball and the child, or the person, whatever, that gives them their identities, but does not always already constitute that identity. So before they entered that agreement, that kind of machinic synthesis, neither of them had those titles. So neither of them, the ball was just a ball, wasn't a soccer ball, and the child was, just a child, not a soccer player. So I think this is a pretty germane example in that the ball then, let's say, is picked up by a child who wants to use it as a basketball, So then different titles are then assumed or taken on. So there is some kind of fluidity here, but it's a fluidity that in their synthesis, kind of concretizes them for a moment. So it galvanizes both of those two actors in that moment, galvanizes them, but then from which they can eventually, or whenever they want, come apart from it. So what the psychoanalyst might do in response to this, the kind of illustration I drew here, would be to suggest that, there is a real essence of each of those two different beings in that moment. So the ball has, a ball essence, and we can then get at the roots of that by giving it, endowing it with this identity. And then with the child, we say, deep down you are really just a child. And we know X, Y, and Z qualities about a child. So we, by virtue of that, must ask you X, Y, and Z questions to comply with that. So for Deleuze and Guattari, they propose that this is an analytical fallacy. That is, Freud assumes, or the psychoanalytic imaginary assumes, that there is a subject defined as a fixed ego of one sex or the other, who necessarily experiences as a lack his and their subordination to the tyrannical complete object. So the tyrannical complete object being, in their estimation, this phallus, right? This phallus that is, unchanging, undifferentiated, always a matter of desire, something that people need in order to have power, for instance. Whereas for them, that's the totally incorrect axiom. Like, it does not hold up to very much scrutiny. So what is also embedded within this discourse is the idea of a subject, right? Which was I kind of alluded to earlier. So the idea of there being individual fantasies, and by virtue of that, these problems being reduced to individual problems. So I think an easy way we can understand that is kind of the belief that everything is personal, as opposed to political. So if someone has a problem with, it's undergoing some kind of issue, the tendency in our Oedipal world is to say, okay, well, let's fix you. Let's straighten you out so that you can then fit within the social order. Let's, institutionalize you or whatever to make sure that you can exist in this world. But that is not the only subject of interest for the psychoanalytic imaginary, because they also consider the way that groups work in this way as well. So, and I actually did that, I think the seminal Freudian text for that on here somewhere, if you look at the channel under the categories under Freud. So the idea for Freud is that generally, to put it quite simply, that group psychology is not about people getting stupider in group settings, and that in fact there's a kind of cohesion between people that is guided by love, and that these people find something in being with others that share a kind of common goal that they can't really get in an individual setting. So what Deleuze and Guattari are saying here is that, okay, well, maybe at first glance, the idea of group fantasy might be a better solution to the individual fantasy, because at least with groups, there would have to be some kind of an acknowledgement of a kind of agreement that has occurred between more than one person with themselves, which would then have to extend beyond the domain of an individual. But for Deleuze and Guattari, that's not the case, where they end up saying that, this group fantasy discourse is really just another homogenizing tool. But that doesn't mean that for them the group fantasy is totally lost, or that the potential behind it is lost. They say, in fact, the revolutionary pole of group fantasy becomes visible, on the contrary, in the power to experience institutions themselves as mortal, to destroy them or change them according to the articulations of desire and the social field, by making the death instinct into a veritable institutional activity. So in this process, one that we could kind of attach to, I think, many revolutionary movements throughout the course of history, the idea that people come together in groups can have really devastating effects for the formations of power and institutions and law and all that, where they say that the group fantasy, actually I'll jump back a little bit. But group fantasy no longer has anything but the drives themselves as subject, and the desiring machines formed by them with the revolutionary institutions. The group fantasy includes the disjunctions in the sense that each subject, discharged of his personal identity, so I'll say here, kind of stripped of what they've been Oedipalized or kind of projected with in the psychoanalytic imaginary, that is imbued with an ego that, determines who they are. So they are stripped of that in the group fantasy formation, stripped of his personal identity, but not of his singularities, and enters into relations with others following the communication proper to partial objects. Everyone passes into the body of the other, of the body without organs. So the body without organs being they describe at one point as like a slippery thing, being a kind of, I'm going to say blank slate, but I say it with reservation because it's not really a blank slate. But the body without organs is kind of the screen onto which things can be projected. And then by virtue of things being projected, it then houses the meaning projected onto it. So let's go back to the kid with the ball. So when the kid picks up the ball, let's say they're playing in a field, okay? That field operates as a body without organs, where however the kids choose to operate with the ball on that field, on that empty space, on that body without organs, will then determine the body without organs. So you have a child playing with a ball as a soccer player, as a soccer ball, and then the field becomes a soccer field because of these organs kind of being thrown onto it, or these machines existing onto it like that. But this presents a problem. So where does the subjectivity lie in that? Because that would imply that there's kind of like an active subject, determining what will become of the relationship with the ball and the child. Like the child being the one that determines it. But in some ways, the ball might be the one determining it. If the ball has certain patterns on it, like if it has, the kind of curvy lines that you'd find on a basketball, or if it has the checkered pattern of a soccer ball, or if it has a kind of bumpy texture of like a dodgeball or kickball or something, then, in a sense, that ball will be determining what it's used for, and then what the field, the body without organs, what kind of identity it will take on, right? But if we are really just dealing with things in their most undescript way, where the ball really is just a round ball, and the child is just a regular child, we can think that maybe the how these things will come into play with one another is left up to chance to some extent, because it's a game time decision what this ball is going to be used for. Pun intended. All right, so then this gets into the broader question about syntheses. So they present us with 3 syntheses in this chapter. And this is, in my mind, the most complicated thing, and I have trouble reconciling them or figuring out what exactly they mean and how they differ from one another. So they are as follows. There's the connective synthesis, the disjunctive synthesis, and the conjunctive synthesis. So there are 2 ways that I want to try and propose that these things exist. So we can think of these 3 syntheses as being periods of time, where the so-called primitive time would correspond to a connective synthesis kind of formulation. the industrial age, if we can think of that, or the movement of religion, or sorry, let me back up here. So we have in the connective synthesis the primitive age, so the pre-state age. Then we have the disjunctive synthesis. That is one that is formulated under the heading of under a state formation or under tyrant, under kings and emperors and all that stuff. And then the conjunctive synthesis existing under industrialization and capitalism. So, okay, I really hope that I'm not fucking this up, because I'm fairly confident that I'm somewhere around the mark here. So when we think of syntheses in these ways as being temporally contingent, well, let's move through them one by one. So the connective synthesis is the one where people have a direct relationship, in a sense, with all things around them. So the land is something that, determines you to some extent, where the land machine meets the human machine, and then there is like a direct need for that relationship. Think of like hunters and gatherers, for instance, where the people are totally dependent on the land being something that will provide for them, almost because the land has a mind of its own. And, we must sacrifice ourselves to feed the sun, right? To then keep the growth going. Well, that's actually, scratch that example. But there's a direct relationship between things in a kind of romantic way. I think it would help for us to think about it romantically to kind of grasp it better. That is a more fruitful connection to the land and to other people and all that. So then comes along the age of the state and the tyrant. This is the disjunctive synthesis age, where then you have someone coming in that is an emperor, tyrant, or something, who then partitions off the land and says, this part of land has this function, this one has that function, and so on and so forth. And then you people, you slaves, are going to work on this plot of land, and you over here are going to work on this one, and so on and so forth. So it's kind of like the introduction of a caste system, or a hierarchization of this of the land, essentially. So then the land is split up, and by virtue of its being partitioned, and then people being partitioned according to the land, what we have is a disjunction, right? A kind of disconnection between people and between land, where people who are forced into a certain plot of land or a certain area can't be said to have a kind of natural connection to the land, where there isn't a natural synthesis that occurs, but it is a disjunctive one in that it's kind of forced together, like a puzzle piece that doesn't fit into the puzzle, but that, if you hit it hard enough and mold it, you can get it to go in there. So then finally we enter the conjunctive synthesis. That is the one of capitalism, where there is a kind of a superficial return to a limitlessness, to the limitlessness present to us or made manifest in the connective age, where, there's a direct relation to, things with the relative deterritorialization of the globe and of people. Anyone is free to go where they please, but of course not everyone, because people don't have the same privileges really across the board. But people have generally, maybe I'll say, the privilege to go wherever they want, to learn about anything they want. That really represents a new formulation, a new system. But there's also these axioms being placed upon us, or these limits that are placed upon us, but they are limits that aren't necessarily worked from without by like an emperor or by a tyrant or something. Instead, they are very much embedded within the very logic of capitalism, where it's like, liberate yourself, but not too much, or be a revolutionary, but not too much. It's kind of like the Starbucks revolutionary ideals, right? Like, or in the case of Canada currently, like banning plastic, single-use plastic, like as though that's going to make things better, or as though that's going to push us in a better direction. So I think roughly we could think about these syntheses in that way, like as a temporally contingent, or as temporally contingent phenomena. But then I think we can think about them in a more here and now type way, where people, and all things for that matter, always meet up to some extent with these various syntheses. So we can have connective syntheses today, just as we can have disjunctive syntheses and then conjunctive syntheses. So it would be too simple to just say that the so-called primitive age was one guided by connective and then disjunctive or disconnective or whatever, and then conjunctive. Instead, we have to be prepared to acknowledge that all these syntheses are working at all at the same time, but that at various periods, one of them, tends to take command, I would say. So today, us belonging to the logic of the conjunctive synthesis, something like the Oedipal paradigm or Oedipalization might seem kind of strange, because that is a territorializing. That is, it closes off, forecloses possibility, and doesn't really give way to the limitlessness present in advanced capitalism per se. So there's that kind of weird relationship there. But as they tell us in other texts, and I'm sorry I gotta jump to another one, and I've talked about it here with a friend of mine, the From a Thousand Plateaus Apparatus of Capture, which I definitely recommend people listen to. But we could understand Oedipus or Oedipalization as what they call a compensatory re-territorialization. So in a world that is moving very sporadically and out of control, we take comfort in attaching certain significance to various different institutions. So here we have Oedipus, but other people might attach certain significance to the state. Some might attach certain significance to, gender differences, certain significance to religion. Go on. The possibilities are endless here. And this really portends, or this sets the stage for a line they give us in the third chapter, which we'll get to next time, where they essentially say that, maybe capitalism is good because it does break down things. It doesn't, foreclose or homogenize. But it's not so simple as that. So don't typing like, oh, you idiot. But better than capitalism for them in crushing the kind of homogenizing tendency of Oedipalization is for them schizoanalysis, or the schizophrenic. So the schizophrenic was introduced to us in the first chapter as being that figure that opposes all restraint, that opposes all institutional kind of formations and codes and conduct, and is kind of free to traverse anywhere. That's kind of unfiltered. Where they say that the schizophrenia is for them, so on page 69, is the land of the unknown. So in this land, binary distinctions come crashing down, like the distinction between man and woman, for instance, where these two fold into one another and blend with one another, really tearing apart the idea about castration and lack and desire. And you can, insert any kind of binary here, will eventually get crushed under the weight of the psychoanalytic deterritorialization, or kind of freedom. But I should say that, and I think a lot of people get this wrong, I think a lot of people believe that deterritorialization is a good thing, whereas for Deleuze and Guattari, it's not so good all the time. Like it sometimes presents kind of radical possibility, revolutionary possibility, but at the same time, it is the logic that guides, emperors being able to come in and deterritorialize, so that is kind of dig up the land, essentially, and then redistribute it, because it's been deterritorialized, it's been taken apart. So it's important to know that it's neither, a really good thing, nor is it a really bad thing. Okay, so let's get into one of the more difficult kind of philosophical ideas that they contend with. So they take up Kant here. So they say that Kant was interested in finding out if there was what he called a criteria immanent to understanding that could then distinguish between so-called legitimate and illegitimate uses of the syntheses of consciousness. So, as they write, in the name of transcendental philosophy, that is the immanence of criteria, he therefore denounced the transcendent use of syntheses such as appeared in metaphysics. In like fashion, we are compelled to say that psychoanalysis has its own metaphysics. Its name is Oedipus. And that a revolution, this time materialist, can proceed only by way of a critique of Oedipus, by denouncing the illegitimate use of the syntheses of the unconscious as found in Oedipal psychoanalysis, so as to discover a transcendental unconscious defined by the immanence of its criteria, and a corresponding practice that we shall call schizoanalysis. So the idea of immanence of criteria is how this criteria, the legitimate form, is found within schizoanalysis because of its materialist, its faithfulness or its fidelity to a materialist mind frame. That is one that is rooted in what they call the real. And the schizo, for them, explodes the illegitimate kind of genealogy performed by the Oedipalization or by Oedipus. But the existence of the schizo is interesting. So the schizo might be said to have always already existed. The schizo was present in the connective synthesis and the disjunctive one. The mad person, as Foucault described it, maybe might fit that criterion. But they also say something kind of interesting. So they suggest that in the psychoanalytic paradigm, that is the Oedipal psychoanalysis, that there is present a double bind. So this is the idea that psychoanalysis essentially just creates the problems that it purports to solve. So there's no actually getting out of it, because according to Deleuze and Guattari, who suggest that according to Oedipal psychoanalysis, either you will be psychoanalyzed and we will fix you and straighten you out, essentially make you proper for society, or you will keep going down the kind of, you will keep being fucked up by your neuroses or whatever, and you will go down that route. So for Deleuze and Guattari, they're like, well, both of these options seem to suck. So the schizo is like essentially the one positing no to that double bind. So for them, it is in the sense that Oedipus should be presented as a series or an oscillation between two poles, the neurotic identification and the internalization that is said to be normative. On either side is Oedipus, the double impasse, and if a schizo is produced here as an entity, this occurs for the simple reason that there is no other means of escaping this double path, where normality is no less blocked than neurosis, and where the solution offers no more of a way out than does the problem. Hence the schizo's withdrawal to the body without organs. So the body without organs being that zone that doesn't ascribe by that same kind of predetermined logic. So the body without organs for them was first marked by races, cultures, and their gods. This is on page 85. So races, cultures, gods, all being their own things, of course, represent different intensities or different kind of possibilities or zones of possibilities on the body without organs. And because these things are never galvanized completely, they're never set in stone, they are always in flux, they're always changing. And the person, the kind of schizo figure, is free to move around, free to move from pole to pole. But that, will inevitably lead to conflict, like the ones seen throughout the course of history, where various, identities butt up against others. But that none of these identities are, determined in advance. They are, by virtue of their being projected onto the body without organs, determined. And because that projection is a rather flimsy one, and it's simply a representation, kind of an illustration, it is then susceptible to flux and change, just like the idea that man and woman can be, they fold into one another, change. Any of these different identities can fold together and change on the body without organs. So the schizo is ontologically, so they are, their essence, their being, is much more in line with the movements of reality, because these movements are always determined by the syntheses that are occurring all the time. And like I was saying, these syntheses are what constitute the two poles that make the synthesis, therefore calling into question any the permanence of any of either of the identities of the things that make up the synthesis, that is their being a thing in themselves, gets thrown out the window. Because no structure for them exists prior to these syntheses. So no structure for them exists in the mind, divorced from reality, divorced from material, divorced from these connections, these machines. Everything is instead, and this is on 97, if structures do in fact exist, they do so in immediate reality. So schizoanalysis is highly radical, and for them it is a form of psychoanalysis if we take the kind of the form that psychoanalysis assumes, that is a process of, engaging with someone. It is for them then, or I should say, schizoanalysis therefore does not hide the fact that it is a political and social psychoanalysis, a militant psychoanalysis. So it doesn't shy away from questions that pertain to the social field, the socius. So the goal of schizoanalysis for them is to analyze the specific nature of the libidinal investments in the economic and political spheres, and thereby to show how, in the subject who desires, desire can be made to desire its own repression. So this is Nietzschean, coming out of the genealogy of morality, I think we could say pretty safely, the idea that the ascetic ideal, like someone who says no to themselves or hates themselves, or, wanting to atone for the supposed sins they've committed, they whip their back or hate themselves as an effect. So what they want to say is that schizoanalysis can actually get at the heart of the root of those kind of the hatred of oneself, in order to present like a kind of possibility for anyone, as opposed to the Oedipal psychoanalysis that wants to really close you in, right? It wants to deny you the possibility. So it's no coincidence then, or it's not a surprise that they say that Oedipus depends upon discrimination and it depends upon hierarchy, because these are two things that like things to be closed. They like things to not have contact with a kind of exteriority to them. So here are some of the differentiations between Oedipus and between desiring production indicative of schizoanalysis. So for schizoanalysis or desiring production, it predicates itself on partial objects or non-specific ones, that is, ones that aren't totalizing, inclusive or non-restrictive formula, and then it is more, it has a firm connection to nomadic or polyvocal configurations. Whereas for Oedipus, what we have are global and specific, we have exclusive and restrictive, and then segregative and biunivocal. So really the way that they bifurcate the two here, I think, is pretty clear. Like one is pretty restrictive and one is much more open. So as opposed to psychoanalysis, as these distinctions might make clear, desire and desire's lack and the Oedipal framework has a very firm connection to all these institutions that comprise this world. So it's no surprise then that there are people that claim that psychoanalysis actually helps to some extent, or it kind of mitigates some of the burdens imposed by these institutions. That is because these institutions set up in advance the problem that psychoanalysis can claim to solve. So one of the ways that Deleuze and Guattari kind of think about that is in terms of prohibition. So for Freud, the idea was that the prohibition of various things, incest, for instance, by the law, would then point to the extent to which they are desired. Whereas for Deleuze and Guattari, they say that it is the law apparatus in its prohibition of something that enters that thing into human desire, that propels it into human desire. So Oedipal desires are the ones that we see in the Oedipal framework are just kind of bait. They're kind of red herrings, to try and convince us of them being real desires, right? being things that somehow transcend our current material situation in favor of these universal, truths. Whereas the schizoanalysis has a much firmer connection to a social field that is not simply predicated by 5 institutions like church, state, family, school, and health, or something like that. Insert anything here, but has a more organic, more holistic connection to the social field as something more than just those things. So these ideas are really explained, I think, in better detail, a little clearer, in 1,000 Plateaus, especially the kind of first few chapters of that. So I definitely recommend, checking those out. But I think on that note, there's not much more to say. If anyone's read this, they would probably, I don't know if they'd agree with me, but I'd say that it's pretty repetitive. Like, there are times when I wonder if it's really necessary for Freud to tell us, or for Deleuze and Guattari to tell us that, Oedipus relies too heavily on the family, or this triangulation between mommy, daddy, and child. But with that, it's still a great chapter, and overall a great book. And next time we'll get into the 3rd chapter. I don't even think I said the name of this. God, the 2nd chapter here. Oh, what's it called here at the end? Psychoanalysis and Familialism, the Holy Family. I don't know why the hell I didn't say that before. But then we'll move into, next time, the chapter on savages, barbarians, and civilized men, which gives like it should be like 3 chapters really, but gives a very detailed account of kind of the development of present day society, from the so-called primitive age through the imperialistic and barbaric ones all the way up to today. So that's a monolith, that one. But on that note, for anyone that listened, I hope you got something out of this. And if you had any comments, you know how to do it. But on that note,